Morning, everybody. Michael here. I hope you're ready to do a little study today in Luke's Gospel, Luke and Acts. This is again, it's a project that's happening. So you're witnessing my research in the making, as it were. What I'm doing, what I'm interested in, the questions I'm asking about the birth narratives. Now, one of the things we saw with regard to Matthew's birth narrative is that it absolutely ties Jesus back into Judaism. We saw the Abraham parallels, the David parallels, the Moses parallels, and we saw that the structure of this narrative was deeply indebted to Judaism, including the first of the 11 or so citation formulas found in Matthew's Gospel. We saw that as Amy Richter had pointed out, a number of themes that run through that gospel are a critique of the origins of evil in the world and kind of this redemptive approach toward the Enoch worldview. Marvelous in itself, of course. Now we come to Luke. We come to quite a different birth narrative, of course. We have a whole host of questions we have to ask. So what I'd like to do is these are obviously questions that you're not going to answer, but what I'd like to do is just show you some of the questions that I've had to wrestle with as we deal with these birth narratives. So the way I tend to get into everything when it comes to the Gospels, of course, and it's buried under a pile. My desk has got like 20 books on it here. It's absolutely terrible. When I come to the Gospels, I always go to a synopsis, the kind of thing that allows me to compare the same story in a Greek text in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or if it happens to be one of the few in all four Gospels, then John as well. And there's also texts from the early church fathers and other writings that would relate to anything that's found in the Gospels. That's the first thing I do, is I've got to go there and just start looking at tendencies of writers and what's included and what's not included. And I mentioned to you previously that one of the things that Luke does is he chunks his gospel. And I showed you that chart from Joachim Jeremias' New Testament Theology, where one of the things that Luke does is he writes is that at 5 places, he will chunk the Gospel of Mark into his narrative. It's already a fixed narrative. And so sections of Mark just get brought in and just set down right in this already formed narrative that Luke has. And if you want to do something fun, you would go colorize your Bible. One way that I've done this in the past is to I'm going to look for a section I can show you, different colored pens. So I have a little pen here that does different colors, right? And I would go through and I would, any section that Luke has from Mark, I've got, sectioned off in green. Any section where Luke has material only found in Luke, that gets sectioned off in red. Any material that Luke shares in common with Matthew that's not found in Mark gets sectioned off in blue. And so my text ends up having these little, I don't know if you can see this or not, if I'm even showing it to you, hard to see, I imagine. You can perhaps see where I've got the green and the red there marking the text in the margin. So I would know, am I reading Markan material in Luke? Am I reading special Luke material in Luke? Am I reading common source material in Luke? Whether you want to call that Q, I don't. I think you can dispense with Q entirely. Then that's the first thing I want to do, is I want to see Luke's the way Luke constructs his narrative. And then, of course, I already know from 951 through 1814, there's no Mark. No Mark at all from 951 to 1814. In fact, you only have Mark chunked out really twice prior to that. And then you got to wait until after this whole travel narrative, where at the beginning, 951, Jesus sets his face like a flint to Jerusalem and just kind of goes straight there. And then only does he begin to go back to Mark. So that's what Luke does. Of course, he does his uh, editing, as it were, his redacting when he's quoting the market text. Sometimes his text is similar to Matthew, sometimes to Mark. It depends on how they're cleaning it all up and what their various tendencies are and how they do these things. But what you'll find is that Luke has a very clear agenda to take Jesus back to Judaism in his birth narratives, just like Matthew does. And of course, I've already mentioned to you David Moser's thesis in his book, Lord of the Banquet, which I rely upon because I think it's an excellent thesis, that in the travel narrative from 951 through 1814, Luke has taken a number of important motifs about the prophet who's rejected about Moses, the rejected prophet, from the book of Deuteronomy. And he's woven this travel narrative to show that Jesus is this prophet like Moses, this rejected prophet like Moses. And I've talked previously about the importance of the rejection theme in all the Gospels. I mean, it's right there in the prologue of John. He came to his own did not receive him. Mark's entire gospel is a conflict narrative, really. Matthew, it's shot through, and of course in Luke as well. The rejection of the gospel is a huge theme in the early church, and we do well to pay attention to that. Okay, now, with regard to Luke, why do you suppose in the early church any gospel writer would feel a need to tie Jesus back into Judaism? I mean, Paul, think about this, and I'll go back to Paul. The break that occurs between Paul and Jerusalem Christianity at Antioch over the issue of whether or not the Gentiles have to first subscribe to certain elements of Jewish law, circumcision, Sabbath, kosher, before they can become Christians. That is, Gentiles have to become Jews in order to become Jewish Christians. That's the argument of the so-called Judaizers in Galatia. Paul saying, no, they don't. Now, do we see these themes being played out? We certainly do. We see them being played out in Jewish Christianity, the literature of Jewish Christianity, and the literature that we would call the Apostolic Fathers. Ignatius, we see this being played out in the Epistle of Barnabas, the Letter of Hermes, the Didache. I mean, the question about Judaism and Christianity was solved in a number of ways by Jewish Christianity to various degrees, but not all those solutions were good and not all of them worked. And we see this in the early church in the 2nd century. I mean, again, the real difficult thing here to do as you're trying to even begin to think through this is, first of all, you have to think geographically. So you've got the Mediterranean, right? And you've got Palestine over here, and you've got Rome over here, right? I think I'm doing this correct. I'm trying to do it all backwards. And so you've got Antioch, and then you've got Alexandria, and then, oops, going this way over to north, and whoops, going this way, come on, fingers, never mind, going this way over to Libya, North Africa, Carthage, up to Rome, across to Greece and Asia Minor there, Ephesus, Corinth, and then what is now modern-day Turkey, and then across to Syria, and of course, all the Jewish Christianity in what is now Iraq and Iran and in Egypt, as well as around the Mediterranean, diaspora communities we see in Rome, we see it in Ephesus. So Christianity spreads. Just remember, too, you've got Samaritanism that spread. There are Samaritan synagogues in Greece and on the island of Delos. So Samaritan is a religious phenomenon as well. You have to have that geography, but you have to also now take each of those areas through time. Okay, so where are documents to be located? Well, what do they reflect? And so you learn about what's happening at each of these major areas: Rome, Ephesus, Carthage, Alexandria, Antioch, Caesarea. You learn about what's happening in these places, and then you can begin to see trends in the literature, how it relates to other literature, both Jewish and Christian, because remember, the Jews haven't stopped writing just because of the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Before the Gospels are written, they continue writing too. So you have Fourth Ezra and Baruch and Josephus and other writers writing about Judaism. And of course, Josephus with his little mention of Jesus and John the Baptist. All of this, you have the geography, and then you have to take that geography through time, and then you're dealing with relationships. You know, how does this seaport and its Christian community relate to this seaport and its Christian community? If there happens to be commerce back and forth between the two, and perhaps there's more commerce between A and B than there is between, you know, E and F and C and D and these kinds of things. And you have to take into account the fact that the texts that are being transmitted, what we call the New Testament, these texts, when were they collected? Who collected them? Who brought them together? When were they written? Why were they written? How were, not how, but, you know, to whom were they written? Where were all of these questions get brought into play? What's the relationship between, say, the writer of Luke Acts and the Apostle Paul? Is it a real relationship? Is Luke a historical figure? You know, if so, then we have to see him birthed in the late 30s at the latest, maybe around 40, because he can only be a young man. And when Paul in the 50s is traveling by sea, and you have the we narratives of Acts, and if you tend to date Luke and Acts as late as 120, well, you got him being 90 years old at that point. So, you know, so you have to raise these questions. Are we dealing with a historical figure? Is the writer of the we sections in the book of Acts Luke, the physician? Or is that person the actual composer of the entire book? And that's why scholars today talk about 1 Acts and 2 Acts, because Acts 1 through 15 is one source. And then Acts 16 through other significant portions of the gospel, almost to the end, is another source. That's why you'll have Acts 1 through 15 is and they, and they, and they. But then you get to a section in Acts 16, it's and we, and we, and we. Somebody has joined, somebody's writing a travelogue. In fact, whoever it is that's writing this travelogue can't be that young, because when you get to Acts 27 and the maritime voyage and the shipwreck and everything else that happens in that passage. And I love to do this to anybody that says they know Greek. I say, okay, do me a favor, translate Acts 27. Because in that text, there's several hundred words that are never found in the New Testament. And they're all related to maritime language, you know, ships being on the lee and keels and hulls and everything related to maritime language. One time in the New Testament, of course, nobody's going to memorize all these words that occur one time, and so they just get absolutely flustered and stymied. But whoever this writer was is familiar with that kind of language. So it's got definitely, I think, has to be a seasoned sailor. Somebody that knows how to describe what's happening on the ocean, like Marcion. Not that Marcion wrote Acts, but I just like Marcion. Marcion was from a shipbuilding family as well. No connection other than that. All right. So you wonder, well, okay, let's assume that Luke Acts is written a little later. Well, we're assuming that the writer uses Mark. Is that correct? Of course, because we see how he chunked it. And so we have to have Mark written first. Well, when do we date Mark? Well, again, your common consensus among scholars, it's not so common that it's unarguable. You can still argue against it, is that Mark wrote first, after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Luke Acts reflects that. In fact, the Luke's apocalyptic discourse in chapter 21 actually reflects the historical phenomenon of the armies surrounding Jerusalem. That is, as it's using its tradition, it gives that historical detail. But it is obviously written prior to 132, the second revolt under Bar Kokhba. So Luke Acts is dated somewhere between 72 and 132. That's a 50-year period. Well, can we pin it down any more than that? Now, again, if in my older supposition Luke uses Matthew, it would be easy to date Luke around the end of the first century, certainly, wouldn't it? at least a first edition of the gospel. Again, I told you I hold the synoptic problem theories very lightly. I think you have to. In a sense, I think they're almost insoluble for lots of reasons. As to who wrote first, who borrowed from whom, what's the literary relation between the three, if there is a relationship, or the relation to oral tradition. And so this is not something set in stone. You just can't ever do that, I don't think, with regard to the synoptic problem. And then, of course, the relationship of the synoptics to the Johannine narrative is a whole nother conundrum. But it is important to note that there's no real mention of the book of Acts in the early church until the end of the 2nd century. The book of Acts seems to be a book that is not well known in the 2nd century. May well, and the wonderful thing about scholarship is you get to explore all these kind of fun, strange theses that sometimes seem to work together. And the one I'm exploring now is whether or not we can say that Luke and Acts are being composed between 100 and 120. Do we in fact find 2 editions of Luke? One prior to Marcion's appropriation of it, and another following. Let me tell you what I mean. So I've referred to you several times to the thesis of James Edwards, his book, The Hebrew Gospel and the Development of the Synoptic Tradition. And again, I think he has made a fairly watertight case that not only did this Hebrew Gospel exist, but that in fact Luke uses that gospel as his primary gospel structure into which he's going to chunk Mark, those sections of Mark. So for Luke, the Hebrew gospel then would be this narrative. Now the Hebrew gospel would begin with the birth narratives as we have them. That's where they come from. This special material found in Luke, for example, the parable of the Good Samaritan, or the parable of the prodigal son, or certain discourses, engagements with the Pharisees, and other things, these all come from the Hebrew gospel. That's where they come from. Okay? Now, again, trying to locate this text in space and time, and we don't have a physical copy unless the Vatican has a copy hidden away somewhere. There's no physical copy that exists. It's a scholarly reconstruction based upon the testimony of the early church fathers, and then the hard work that folks like Edwards and others have done to discern the outlines of the Hebrew gospel. We still don't have any kind of a critical edition of this thing. I mean, it doesn't exist. And whether it can be put together or not, I don't know. I mean, we have managed to reconstruct Marcion's gospel and Paul's letters just from a lot of research that's been done in the early heresiologists. So why not, I would suppose, but I think the easy way would be to go knock on the Vatican door and say, could we look at the secret archives, please, and find the copy of the Hebrew Gospel? That would be the easiest, I think. If there is one, it's got to be there, you know. It's nowhere else. They got everything there. Alrighty, so, you know, let me say this to you. Does any of this matter? No. I mean, does it really matter? No, in one way, this where you date it and who you say wrote it and all this. No, it doesn't. But what it does is it helps clarify a crisis that's occurring in Christianity, literally from the beginning. When Paul breaks, in a sense, say in the 40s, say 48 Antioch, from there forward. And the end result of this is going to be someone like Justin Martyr, who comes along and says, if you're a Jewish Christian, you can't follow the Torah. You just got to toss the Torah. And that's a position that the Apostle Paul would never take. So here, I'm going to ask you to think about this. We'll come back to this. I'm going to need to take a break here. I hear folks coming home, so I do need to go see how everybody's appointments went with their doctors. But I'll come back to this, perhaps, maybe later today, but more than likely over the weekend. When you're reading Luke, again, if you can, if you have a synopsis available, go through and mark those places out where only Luke has that text, that story, that parable, that narrative, whatever it is. And then chunk out all the places where Luke follows Mark. They're not that many. They're just 4 or 5 great big chunks. And then, of course, your common material to Matthew and Luke. You'll get at least a feel for what Luke is going to be doing when he says at the beginning of his gospel, right off the bat in 1:1, he says, many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the first, to write an orderly account for you. We want to see why Luke calls this an orderly account, what's important to him. And then we're also going to be looking at the virgin birth in the early church. And we're going to be asking the question, the big question of what's going on here with regard to this gospel. Has Marcion radically misinterpreted Paul? So much so that Luke feels that he has to get in and offer a second edition of his gospel and then the book of Acts? I think we might discover something like that, but the whole point of it is we have to learn as modern Christians how to relate to Judaism, and we don't know how to do that. There's 2 ways primarily it's done right now: be pro-Palestinian or be Zionist. Those are the only 2 options. And we see progressive Christianity as pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, anything to do with Israel, down, down, down. And we see the Zionists here, the Christian Zionists, the Jewish Zionists in America, everything to do with Israel, up, up, up. And neither one of these approaches is the way either Luke or Matthew connects Jesus to Judaism. And you see, it's so important to note, isn't it, that the issue today that we see of Christianity's relationship to Judaism is not a solved issue. Never has been. This goes all the way back to Antioch, folks. It goes all the way back to Galatians 2. We see it lifting its head up in all the New Testament literature everywhere, and the post-apostolic literature, and literature on into the 2nd century. This is not a solved issue. Never has been. And that's why it's important to look at these birth narratives and ask, I think for us in America today, to look at these birth narratives and ask what is going on here? And how can we be theologically sensitive to these issues in our own time? So we'll talk about that more next time. Hope you have a great day. Peace and love, everybody. Cheers. Bye now.